that in certain cases the directors, the remuneration received are paying higher tax. Then what will be the impact? Where also all this justification will require to be done?
See, there you can give this kind of an argument. You need not get into detailed justification. But the issue will be more for, say, promoter directors, where they are also having shares. Then the whole idea and objective of covering this was that whether in guise of dividend you are paying to them remuneration. Because the point is that if you would have paid dividend, there would have been dividend distribution tax. But in this situation, and plus you could have also claimed a deduction under the company. So if you are paying more, what is happening is you're claiming a deduction under the company. You're not also paying dividend distribution tax, because otherwise you would have given a dividend. So the intent was to really capture these. Now how do you capture this? So let's understand that the objective was not to really cover the whole gamut. But unless you don't cover, then one cannot just pinpoint this and say that in the law you should only cover these kind of transactions. Either you cover or you don't cover. Doing an in-between thing, like you said, that whether the effective tax rate is nil, not nil, would be a much more onerous task and responsibility on the chartered accountant in each case to see whether that transaction has a tax neutral impact or not has an impact. Now that you can leave it to scrutiny, at the end of the day, if it's such a genuine case as you're saying, then the AO will anyway not have a problem, or the TPO will anyway not have a problem.
And whether the past payments will help, madam, past remuneration and now what they have been continuing, or the increment which is just proportion to that sales and all that assessments have been accepted in the past, these payments of remuneration and all that will help?
See, that will always help, but there's principles of res judicata do not apply, right? There are so many case laws which say that. So the point is that one can always, you can argue that if the facts are the same, if he is doing what he is doing then and now, the benefit is the same. If earlier it was allowed, then why it should not be allowed? But there it will be important to demonstrate that the facts are same. If you can establish that the facts are same, then you have a good case. Okay, so thank you everyone. Thanks a lot.
Members on the dais, seniors and friends, I think we had very good 2 sessions today morning, and they deserve a definitely well-deserved vote of thanks. First to Madam Malti Sridharan. She has spared her valuable time and despite a busy schedule come and expressed her thoughts. She said that people outside India have got more experience, but Madam, I can assure you that the tax department and the tax professionals will very soon catch up with them and come up to that standard, and in fact others will look towards us just as they are doing for international tax provisions. Thank you for advising that we should bring the assessees also to the assessments, and wishing the domestic firms a very bright practice. I request all of you to carry the vote of thanks first for Madam Sridharan, then for Mrs. Karishma Patarsekar. She has given an excellent overview of the domestic transfer pricing provisions and brought out very important pitfalls which one should keep it in mind while advising our clients, and of course for compliance with the provisions. And we are also thankful to her for designing the program and also coming and giving us a few thoughts over here. I request all of you again to give a very well-deserved loud applause for her. Friends, we'll break for tea for 15 minutes, and the tea will be served near the entrance as well as also at the rear end. We can break and assemble in 15 minutes. Thank you. Friends, good morning again. Let us begin our second technical session. We have with us a very learned faculty, Sri Niharbai Jambusaria, who most of us know. and we can listen to him on the issue of section 40A2, which typically deals with expenses which are paid to related parties. As you know, this section covers different kinds of related parties, parties related directly or by way of having substantial interest, either the payer has it or the recipient has it, either way. This is different from the meaning of associated enterprises, which is there in international transfer pricing provisions. And how is it different? He will explain it to us. We have the phrase of beneficial owner in this section, which has not been defined. Does it cover direct ownership or does it cover through intermediate companies? These are some of the issues which we have in this particular section. I had a quick look at the presentation and he has covered several such issues, whether 40A applies, not applies, substantial interest and things like that. Just one observation, while coming today to this conference, I was just having a look at a few provisions of the Companies Act 2013, where also we have issues related to related party transactions, and we need approvals by way of special resolutions for certain kinds of related party transactions. But one of the exemptions given in those provisions is that if the transaction is in ordinary course of business and on arm's length price, then it does not get covered by those provisions of the company law. I don't know whether satisfaction of arm's length price provisions over here will help us to satisfy provisions under the Companies Act or not. Friends, without taking more of your time, I'll request Namrata to introduce Mr. Nihar Jambusarya formally and then take it forward from there.
Thank you, Naresh sir. As he already said, most of us already know CA Nihar Jambusarya. Despite, I would like to introduce him formally for the purpose of this forum. Shri Nihar Jambusarya is presently the Senior Vice President of Taxation at Reliance. Prior to that, he was in practice the National Head of Tax Advisory Services in BDO Consulting and also a partner in NN Jambusarya and Company. He had been in practice since 1984. He was also a lecturer and head of Department of Accountancy at DTSS College of Commerce in Mumbai. His area of expertise has been advising on domestic, international transactions, inbound, outbound structuring and litigation throughout his career. He has been elected as the Central Council member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India for 2012 to 2015 tenure, and he was the past chairman of the WIRC. During his 6 years regime at WIRC, he has regularly been active in making representations to CBDT, to the Chief Commissioners of Income Tax, etc. And he has been regularly in touch with the profession by presenting more than 300 papers on various subjects of professional interest, including direct taxes, accounting standards, IFRS convergence, etc. at different forums. With that, I request you all to join your hands to welcome our speaker, CA Nihar Jambusarya. Before we proceed to his presentation, I would request President to present him with a memento as a token of our appreciation. So we would begin with
President of the Chamber, CA Yatin, Naresh Bhai, Bhavik, Namrata and friends. In fact, in overview, some of the issues related to section 40A2 were covered. I think to that extent my burden is reduced and we can reserve some more time for question answers. I'll touch upon those issues also because there are one or two more additions or supplements that I would like to add in those issues. But otherwise my mandate is to deal with section 40A2. I was only wondering when Madam DI was mentioning to us that the department has learnt so many things from we the professionals. The only point is, if you look at the checkered history of assessments, particularly transfer pricing assessments, over last 5 years, then in the first year of scrutiny, the additions were to the tune of around 750 crores. And in the last financial year, the department made adjustments of 40,000 crores. I think the Supreme Court judge's remark in GlaxoSmithKline is not instrumental to introducing these provisions, but probably the Finance Ministry thought that if we are able to make this kind of adjustments in international transfer pricing, let us introduce even domestic transfer pricing. And the two previous speakers have mentioned several times that these provisions are very subjective. If we are strong on facts, we can defend the case well. And the facts only, in my experience, can protect us rather than application of formulas and different methods and justifying the method that we apply in computing the arm's length price. So let us take clues from that and take this very seriously. Some of the questions which were asked were very pertinent. Some of the participants were agitated on section 40B, that where this section specifies 12% per annum as the permissible rate of interest payable to partner. How can there be a separate benchmarking under 40A2? We'll deal with these aspects later in the session when we come to justification and benchmarking. But these are definitely very relevant. We do not know whether promises made by the government at the time of introducing 40B will be honored now when transfer pricing provisions are applicable, and they have another tool over and above 40B in the form of 40A2 or transfer pricing provisions to make the adjustments. So keeping this in mind, let us just have a look at these provisions first. I will again give an overview of some of the provisions because they are very much relevant in our discussion. Now, first of all, section 92BA covers what category of transactions? It covers any expenditure under section 40A2B. It covers transactions referred to in section 80A, 80IA 8, 80IA 10, 10AA, or any other transactions which may be prescribed. Now, out of all these, I will cover expenditure under section 40A2. Post lunch, there is a separate session on 80A, 80IA 8 and 10, so I will not touch upon them. Any others as may be prescribed. So far, no other transactions have been prescribed. So I will cover 40A2. Now, transfer pricing regulations, both procedural and penal will apply only if the specified domestic transactions put together exceed 5 crores of rupees every year. Now, many had raised these issues that 5 crores is a very low limit, but we cannot do anything to it for the time being for the first year. We do not know whether for subsequent years the government will accept our presentations that this should be more than 5 crores, maybe in the range of 15 to 20 crores. There is one more point. A question was raised whether if expenditure paid is found to be excessive, and assume for the time being that it does not meet the test of even transfer pricing, and the other entity is also paying tax at the same rate, whether addition will be justified. This question was raised. I think addition is permissible. In that case, there will be double taxation, but one can't avoid if you look at the current provisions. In fact, last year when this was introduced, 2 representations were made to the finance minister. Number one, transfer pricing provisions for 80IA, 10AA are justifiable. But 40A2 should not be covered for the simple reason that even if suppose the payer and receiver are paying tax at different rate, probably now if you look at these transactions beyond 5 crores, normally they will be between companies. And if suppose one company is covered under MAT, another is covered under normal tax, ultimately in the long run, such companies pay tax at the same rate. So in that case, it is only a question of postponement of tax liability by making adjustment in the form of paying excessive expenditure to a relative. And another representation was made that suppose this is not acceptable, you find that another entity, the entity to which payment is made is paying tax at higher rate or lower rate, and therefore you feel transfer pricing should be applied. At least there should be a clear proviso, clear carve out in case where the two entities are taxable at the same rate, these transfer pricing provisions should not be applicable. Now, if you look at practically applicability of these provisions, then to big corporates and big taxpayers, this may not create much of difficulty, but for smaller taxpayers, to benchmark, to apply, select a particular method, to maintain documents, and that too in physical form for a period of 8 years, I think it is going to create a lot of difficulty. But now, given these difficulties, I think we have to implement these provisions, execute them, and we are left with less than 2 months' time now. Before I start with the provisions, one more aspect that I would like to deal with, and it is only an informal suggestion, that it is better if we start uploading these reports as early as possible. You have seen the experience on tax audit reports, that in the last 3 to 4 days, their website was not working, it was not taking the load of the returns that were being uploaded. In spite of that, they did not extend the date. And today the writ petition filed by some societies consisting of chartered accountants as members, because practically and technically probably institute could not have done it. That writ petition is pending. The High Court has ordered the department that you sit with CA Institute and other petitioners and find out a way to this, extend the date, or you announce waiver of interest and penalty, or do something that gives relief to the taxpayers who could not upload their returns on time. So that writ petition is pending, but pending that writ petition, we do not know if these reports are not uploaded at normal speed, and on the last 1 or 2 days if you get stuck, whether you will be able to get extension, waiver of penalty, interest, we are not aware. So it is better that we start this exercise as early as possible. Now, the concept of arm's length price. See, up to now, as everybody discussed, that under section 48(2), the officer had the power of making addition if the expenditure is not found to be at fair market value. It is excessive. To the extent it is found excessive, he was allowed to make adjustment. But now, if you are covered by domestic TP, the transaction is supposed to be at arm's length price. So first, let us have a look at what is arm's length price. Concept of arm's length price is applicable for determining taxable income arising from international transactions since 2001. Now, ALP is defined to mean a price which is applied or proposed to be applied in a transaction between persons other than associated concerns. In uncontrolled transactions, that is where the transaction is between unrelated parties. And as Jayant Bhai was pointing out during the break, in the provisions, the terminology used is market value. So whether there is difference between market value and fair market value. And I think, yes, there is a clear distinction between fair market value and market value. When you judge fair market value, probably so many other factors you may consider, you may add, and although the price doesn't match with market value, it may be possible to justify that this is the fair market value. It would be. Now, in determining arm's length price, when you consider transactions between two unrelated parties, comparability will be fundamental, because with whom you will compare the transaction. I think if we put it absolutely simply, suppose I have made payment for certain goods to a company whose turnover is 5 crores in a year, and that company is a related party under 48(2), and I want to benchmark under CUP and compare this price with the price prevailing in the market. Now, if from public domain or otherwise I select a company whose turnover is 500 crore and who is dealing in similar product, it is possible that that company may be selling this product at low price. So whether it is comparable. Now, comparability will depend upon FAR analysis, function, asset, risk analysis, functions performed, assets employed, risk undertaken. And this is an exhaustive analysis. One should prepare a transfer pricing policy where all these three aspects should be discussed in detail. And I would agree with what the previous speaker said, that instead of fitting every transaction into a method, it is better if we are able to gather facts properly, compare our facts in terms of comparability of functions, assets employed and risks undertaken, and we justify the charging of higher price or lower price. In these terms, it would be better than harping upon a particular method. Now, selection of method is something which I was told to deal with, and I will deal with it in the end, where there are several difficulties. Although there are some expenses which can be generally put under a particular method, but then no particular method is foolproof for the reasons which we will discuss little later. So, comparison of conditions in a controlled transactions with conditions in transactions between unrelated parties will be very fundamental. Now, if you look at the CUP method, the method first requires you to compare your transaction. Once you find a comparable entity and comparable transaction, first compare the price. And if you find that there is difference in the price, then also start searching for difference in conditions. And to give very simple examples of difference in conditions is that I might have paid price to my related entity on CIF basis, whereas the comparable price that I have got from the market between two unrelated parties may be on FOB basis. Now, the difference between FOB and CIF I can reconcile by making adjustment in the price. So, this kind of adjustments are allowed under the CUP method, and since we are not on the methods in particular, I will not go into details. There are many terms and conditions which could be different. For example, risk undertaken. If there is a firm contract, there is no risk and price may be lower. But if there is no firm contract and you are selling to independent parties without any commitment, the risk undertaken is more. Take another example. One party is selling on credit basis, another party is selling on cash basis. So again here there would be adjustment for the interest element for the credit period. So under CUP, first you select a comparable, then make adjustment for the differences in terms and conditions, and here your facts would come very handy. Now, again, when you compare and you talk of arm's length price, let us look at what approach we have in this country and the approach that the other countries have. In our country, in most of the firms, including Big Four, I have seen transfer pricing analysis is done by chartered accountants. Whereas in other countries like UK, USA, in their transfer pricing department, major staff is economists and not chartered accountants. So the exercise that we are doing, I have seen, we ignore economics and most of the factors which go into determination. Now let me give a simple example. Today there was a debate on directors' remuneration. You cannot fit directors' remuneration under any of the 5 methods. Whether CUP, cost plus, RPM, profit split, TNMM, none of the methods is suitable. Now, it is fortunate that by notification number 18, which was issued on 23rd May 2012 last year, they permitted any other method. So, in benchmarking directors' remuneration, probably the HR appraisal, HR study, and apart from HR study, which will talk only of competence of the director or managing director, you may also have to take into consideration various decisions taken by the director which took company to a different level. So this analysis of economics is very important in arguments. I am aware that when we were arguing under 48(2) without transfer pricing, so many such arguments were coming very handy when we had to justify a higher price paid to a related party. The nature of services rendered, the quality of services rendered, the quality of products, the timeliness in supply of goods, the punctuality, all these factors which you will never find in TNMM or any other method, you can add and present before the officer in justification of arm's length price. Particularly when you follow CUP, you can definitely make use of all these factors which are value adds which a related party may be giving you and which may not be available from independent party in the market. So these are various factors which one has to factor into the arguments that you make while representing the case. Now what kind of preparation department makes, whether for domestic transactions they create a separate cell, they have different factors for consideration, is a question to be judged. Of course, on informal basis, an argument that even if I have paid higher price to my related entity who is paying tax at the same rate should justify that there should not be any transfer pricing adjustment. But this will be informal. If he goes by law and becomes too theoretical and impractical, he will say that I will not accept. If it is not at ALP, I will make addition. But you can definitely put up this argument while representing a case. Now, one more point that Karisma informed that in a country like America, domestic transfer pricing is there. Now, let us compare what is the distinction between domestic transfer pricing in that country and our country. In that country, the taxes are at state level. So if one entity is in one state, another is in another state, the domestic transfer pricing applies. Whereas in our country, the income tax is applicable to the entire country at the same rate, same provisions apply, and the income tax is collected by the central government. So at least so far as 48(2) transactions are concerned, we are at disadvantage. In case of 80 IA, 10 AA transactions, it is an exception probably only in this country that within the same entity, transfer pricing provisions are applicable. But here particularly, I personally do not have any grievance, because if one unit is claiming exemption, another unit is not claiming exemption, there is always a tendency to transfer the profit of non-exempt entity to exempt entity. So there, if transfer pricing provisions are applicable, it is justifiable, but 48(2) certainly is problematic. these are the different methods, and I will not focus on this. We all know these 5 methods. Now other method is available, and on other method what transactions we can cover we will discuss when we come to benchmarking. Filing form number 3CEB. Now this is not within my mandate, but one very small point which was discussed in Q&A in last session, I would just like to repeat and have a suggestion that currently if you use income tax utility, the income tax software, there is no space for any remarks that you would like to put. But if you use software supplied by private software suppliers, there are 1 or 2 softwares where they have created a space for attaching PDF files in the form of remark. If suppose you use income tax software where there is no space or there is no provision for attaching a PDF file, what would be the way out? I think you can file physically your remarks in a separate sheet of paper along with the 3CEB report to the assessing officer. This is one way. But if you see technically, whatever you file physically is not valid now. The report is required to be filed electronically. The institute had taken up in last 2 months that both in tax audit report and transfer pricing report, you allow a space for remarks, and that too sufficient space, as much as we require, because we do not know whether remarks will be in 1,000 words or it will be in 2,000 words. They had agreed that they will do it, but so far there is no space for remarks. If they amend the utility, it is available, it is fine. Otherwise, you may use a private software, attach a PDF file with your remarks, because there are so many transactions where you will be required to give remarks, particularly capital expenditure and many others, which we'll discuss again in the course of discussion. Now, these penalties were made known to you in the last session also, and you have seen it in the provisions. Before we start with 40A2B, a small point on what is the objective behind this particular provision. The objective is to discourage excessive payments to associated concerns. This is the objective. And if this is the stated objective when 40A2 was introduced, probably our argument of same rate of tax applicable to payer and receiver may theoretically not hold water. Practically, if the officer thinks of equity, then in such cases he may accept the price even if it is excessive, if both the entities are paying tax at the same rate. But that depends upon the officer only. Now here I would like to go by the provision verbatim, which I have covered elsewhere. Let us look at 40A2, the verbatim provision. Who is a relative? We are on relative now, where the assessee is an individual, any relative of the assessee. Where the assessee is a company, firm, association of persons or Hindu undivided family, any director of the company, partner of the firm or member of the association or family, or any relative of such director, partner or member. Any individual who has a substantial interest in the business or profession of the assessee, or any relative of such individual. We will discuss substantial interest little later. A company, firm, AOP or HUF having a substantial interest in the business or profession of the assessee, or any director, partner, member of such company, firm, AOP or HUF, or any other company carrying on business or profession in which the first mentioned company has substantial interest. Now, if you look at this provision, this last line was added in the last Finance Act. So what difference it makes? Earlier, transaction between holding and subsidiary was covered. Holding company having substantial interest in subsidiary, and subsidiary to holding was also covered, because if the other company has substantial interest in you, you are covered. But with this last line, or any other company carrying on business or profession in which the first mentioned company has substantial interest, this will cover common subsidiary companies of a holding company. So if A Limited has 3 subsidiary companies, B Limited, C Limited, D Limited. Earlier, transactions between B Limited and C Limited, C Limited and D Limited, and A Limited and D Limited were not covered. But with this addition, now transactions between common subsidiaries of a holding company will also be covered. So that is one aspect which has been added by the last Finance Act. Indirect holding, again we will cover separately. It has already been covered, we will repeat. Any person who carries on business, a company, firm, AOP, HUF, of which a director, partner or member has a substantial interest in the business or profession of the SSE, or any director, partner or member of such company, firm, AOP, HUF or any relative, and any person who carries on a business or profession where the SSE is an individual or relative of such SSE, has a substantial interest in the business of or profession of that other person. So even individuals and relatives having substantial interest and vice versa situation is also covered by 40A2. Now 40A2 we are applying for a very long time, and what you must have observed in your tax audit report, that up to last year in tax audit report, I have seen reports even within Reliance Group companies, in tax audit report transactions between holding and step down subsidiaries were reported under 40A2 in clause 17, 17F or something, I don't remember the exact alphabet, but in clause 17 it was reported. Now we are debating, because now transfer pricing provisions are applicable, and formal transfer pricing provisions which we expect to be resulting in various adjustments, we are debating whether step down subsidiaries are covered. And the popular view is that transactions between step down subsidiary and ultimate holding company are not covered. See, the provision talks of substantial interest. If one company has substantial interest in another company, either itself or through director, then the transaction will be covered. Now let us look at how substantial interest is defined in section 40A2B. Substantial interest is defined as, in the case of a company, any person who is the beneficial owner of shares carrying not less than 20% of voting power, and in any other case, any person who is beneficially entitled to not less than 20% of profit of such business or profession. Again, what is beneficial owner? It is not defined in 40A2, but if we go by dictionary meaning, then Black's Law Dictionary defines a beneficial owner is one recognized in equity as the owner of something because use and title belongs to that person, even though legal title belongs to someone else. So look at this definition, meaning of beneficial owner generally, the dictionary meaning. Nowhere this section talks of indirect holding of voting power. It does not talk of indirect holding. Now again, let us compare this with the provision in international transfer pricing. In international transfer pricing, an associated enterprise is defined. And there this 26% holding of voting power, let us see how it is defined. Look at para 2, section 90A2. The term associated entities is clearly defined to include an enterprise holding, and see these words, directly or indirectly, shares carrying not less than 26% of the voting power in the other enterprise. So in international transfer pricing in 98.2, they clearly write the words direct or indirect. Whereas in section 48.2, substantial interest, one should be beneficial owner of 20% of voting power. The words direct or indirect are not used. Let us also see whether we have any support in terms of case laws. The term beneficial owner is used in section 79 also in the same manner. Section 79, carry forward and set off of losses of a closely held company. Now here it says that when there is a change in more than 51% of the beneficial holding in a closely held company, change in shareholding should be seen at immediate holding company level. On section 79, take an example, X Limited holds 75% of share capital of B Limited, and B Limited holds 75% of capital of C Limited. Now if A Limited transfers 75% holding of B Limited, one can say that indirectly it has transferred holding of C Limited also. But we have several judgments that transfer of shares at ultimate holding company level is to be ignored, and here beneficial ownership is to be considered at immediate level, because here also the section does not use the words direct or indirect. So we can use all those judgments in 48.2 and take the view that indirect holding in step down subsidiaries is not covered. But here there is one caveat, that if suppose the officer is able to prove that this intermediary subsidiary company is only a conduit, it is not doing anything, in substance the control of the ultimate subsidiary is with ultimate holding company. In that case probably this argument may not work. But generally if you see in India, although now the new Companies Act permits only 2 layers of holding subsidiary, here we have several companies where there are 6 to 7 levels of subsidiary companies existing. Now one cannot say that all these intermediary companies are conduit and they are not operative and ultimate control lies with the ultimate holding company. So this argument that transactions between a holding company and step down subsidiary are not covered is important. Now let me come back to what we were doing up to last year while writing the tax audit report. Under 48.2 we were reporting even step down subsidiaries because at that time we were not that conscious. I have seen in many reports step down subsidiaries are considered as related party. Now if consciously for transfer pricing we are taking the view that no, step down subsidiaries are not covered, please check that when you copy paste last year's report in current year's tax audit report, you remove step down subsidiaries. Otherwise there will be contradiction between tax audit report and transfer pricing report. And once you report at one place, probably it will not be possible to justify that you are taking a different view. So don't offer it at both the places. That is the only point. One more point which was covered earlier, whether in case of 48.2 transactions, income is covered. Now, after so many discussions, a view has clearly emerged that no, income side is not covered unless it is a transaction between exempt and non-exempt entity or between exempt and non-exempt unit. The only point which was being considered earlier was that section 92(2)(a) is drafted in this way. Any allowance for an expenditure or interest or allocation of any cost or expense or any income in relation to the specified domestic transaction shall be computed having regard to arm's length price. So subsection 2A talks of income also. Is income covered? Now let us look at 92BA. 92BA specifically provides any expenditure in respect of which payment has been made or is to be made to a person referred to in 40A(2)(b). So, in what case then income is covered? Why subsection 2A covers income? It is very clear it covers income only in case of transactions between exempt and non-exempt entity covered by 80